What's up guys, Asian here again with our fourth video of how to get started in vet trials. This particular video is going to be all about tanks, so all the advice and the things I'm going to be talking about in this video is specific for tanks. Now if you guys want more generic tips, tips that basically fit for all three of the different roles in ESO, you will want to check out my first video. I go over pretty much everything that you would need to know, just kind of generically how to get into vet trials in that first video here. Once you have watched that video and kind of have an understanding of the content that I put in there, you can come back to this video and take a look at what you want to do specifically as a tank to prepare for vet trials. So in this video, we'll be covering just basically what you're going to want to know and kind of what to expect when you're going into a vet trials guild as a tank specifically. So very similar to healers, like we talked about in our previous video, because you're a support role, there really isn't a quote objective way to really measure up your performance as a tank. There's going to be some subjectivity involved when it comes to how other guilds kind of assess your performance as a tank. However, there are a few objective things that guilds do look for in a tank before they decide to take one on their team. First one being gear. Gear is obviously the easiest way to kind of separate the good tanks from the bad tanks. There are several sets that you're going to want to pick up as a tank. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just sets that I have found that tanks have used very frequently across all the different types of content. You might need to pick up some other sets depending on what your raid lead wants, but this list should get you in a good place to kind of get started in vet trials. First one is going to be Ebon Armory. This comes from Crypt of Hearts 1 or 2, so it's a base game set. This is probably the most useful set to have for progression style guilds because of that extra health that you give to your allies. For leaderboard guilds, they actually might not even run Ebon depending on the level that they're running at. But for most of us, Ebon is pretty much going to be a staple for tanks. Second set is going to be Alkosh. Roar of Alkosh comes from the Maw of Lorkaj trial, is the medium armor set from there, so you will need to get the jewelry and then weapons. So a sword and shield, so 2 swords and 2 shields, or whatever your one-hand weapon is. And you also want to pick up a frost staff as well. So for all these sets, I do recommend picking up ice staves and weapons as well. The exception being Ebon, because there is currently a bug with Ebon where if you have it on your weapons and you swap, you actually momentarily lose that max health. So it's a little bit weird and a little bit funny how that works. So you want to pick up weapons for all these other sets except for Ebon. So Alkosh is very strong just because of that 5-piece debuff. So it's the strongest resistance debuff in the game right now that is not named. So it is a flat 30-10 decrease in spell and physical resistance, and that does stack with major and minor fracture and breach. So it's a very, very strong set overall. In fact, pretty much all the tanks in the endgame community pretty much run this set on at least one of their tanks. The third set you're going to want to pick up is going to be Akaviri Dragon Guard. This is the heavy armor set from Eastmarch, so you can buy it off guild traders. You can go farm it, whatever floats your boat there. This basically decreases your ultimate cost by 15%. So very nice to have, just basically allows for greater Warhorn uptime, greater major force uptime, which helps improve your DPS by a significant margin. Fourth set here is going to be Torag's Pact. This is actually a crafted set. It requires 3 traits in order to craft whatever item that you want in that for this particular set. So Torag's Pact basically reduces the cooldown of your enchantment and increases the impotency of your enchantment by 30%. So this basically allows you to have a stronger Crusher enchant, a stronger Weakening enchant. So that basically gives you a little bit more of a resistance debuff on your Crusher enchant. So your typical infused Crusher is 2108, but if you have Torag's Pact, an infused Torag's Pact Crusher is 2740. So it increases your Crusher enchant by about 600 or so. That basically allows your DPS to kind of spec a little bit less into spell erosion or piercing and put them into other blue CPs for more damage that way. So it is a crafted set, so it's very easy to obtain, and it's also a lot more consistent than Alkosh because Alkosh does depend on that synergy. So although Torag's is not quite as much of a debuff compared to Alkosh, a lot of progression guilds do try to have that in there just to kind of make up for that Alkosh downtime, just because it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get 100% Alkosh uptime, especially if you're a newer tank or you're starting to focus more on mechanics rather than actual debuff uptimes on Alkosh that way. Those would probably be the 4 major sets that I would pick up. Now there are a few other sets that I do recommend picking up as well. First one's going to be Plague Doctor. This is a heavy armor set that comes from Deshaun, so just like with Akaviri Dragon Guard, you can purchase this off of Guild Traders, you can go ahead and farm it, whatever you floats your boat there. This is just pure raw health, so this is a very selfish set. The 4-piece is 4,000 additional health just to you, so this is really helpful for content that you're just trying to learn, just because it gives you a little bit more survivability, gives you a little bit more tankiness, so that way you can kind of focus in on surviving, learning mechanics, learning how the fight goes, learning kind of your groove, so to speak, working on survivability before you swap it out for another set like Alkosh or Akaviri Dragon Guard. Other set you're going to want to pick up is going to be Powerful Assault. This is actually a PvP set. This comes from, I believe it is a Telvar set, so you can buy it in the Imperial City sewers, or you can purchase it off of Guild Traders. Powerful Assault is very similar to SPC and Olorime, except it is a unique buff, so it actually stacks with Major Courage. The other thing with Powerful Assault is it only affects 4 people. And from what Nevis has told me, it only affects the 4 people with the highest stamina pool that you're able to hit when you use an assault ability. So as a tank, you'll typically be using something like Vigor in order to proc Powerful Assault. So while it is not quite as strong as Olorime, just in terms of its utility, it's still a very strong buff because it does stack with your Major Courage and everything else, because it is not a named buff. So even though it only affects up to 3 other DPS, stamina DPS, it is still a very nice buff to have. I believe it's somewhere like 300 or something spell and weapon damage, so pretty nice to have. I do recommend picking up Powerful Assault. Now I believe it is a medium armor set, so very similar to Alkosh, you do want jewelry and weapons if you are going with Powerful Assault. Now this last set is going to be a little bit controversial, but I do find it to be fairly useful if you do not have a Warden in your group. If you do have a Warden in your group, or I should say a Warden tank or Warden healer, this set is actually completely useless. This set I'm talking about is going to be Warrior Poet. So this is a heavy armor set that comes from Vardenfell, so you can buy it off Guild Traders, or you can farm it if you have access to Vardenfell. The 5-piece gives you minor toughness at all times, which increases your health by 10%. Because tanks typically run pretty high health, it actually works out to be about the same as Plague Doctor. Now, I did say earlier that if you do have a Warden healer or Warden tank, the set becomes useless, and that's just because Wardens do have a passive that does grant minor toughness. Of course, because it is a named buff, it cannot stack with itself. So if you do have a Warden healer or a Warden tank, don't bother getting Warrior Poet, because the 5-piece basically going to go to waste. However, if you do want kind of super tankiness, you can go something like Plague Doctor and Warrior Poet, and you'll have a lot of additional health that way. Now, beyond these sets here, there are obviously some other sets that you might have seen me use, or you might have seen other tanks use on stream or something like that. So for example, Eternal Kata is a set that I like to use, or that Mayflower likes to use. You might have seen people use Green Pact. These sets, while they're nice to have, I do not call them really essential, just because the people who are using them for specific purposes, whether that is to increase their durability, their tankiness, or they're going for something like a no-death run or something like that. So I don't necessarily recommend you pick them up before you start joining vet trials, but at some point I would probably say take a look at trying to get these sort of sets. Those 2 sets are just the first ones that come to mind. However, there are some other sets that you might want to pick up for your tank, sets like Yorvo's Guidance perhaps, or Worm, or even Olorime. There's a lot of different sets out there for tanks, and a lot of it's going to depend on your specific group and kind of what your raid lead wants. So just kind of discuss it with your raid lead and see what sort of sets you're going to want to run for different pieces of content. That's all of your armor sets. Now let's talk about our monster helm sets. So your monster helm sets, there's only a few that you're going to want to pick up, and some of these are base game and some of these are locked behind DLC dungeons, so just bear that in mind. The first monster helm set you're going to want to pick up is going to be Lord Warden. This comes from Imperial City Prison, so you will need access to the Imperial City DLC in order to get it. This is just very nice in terms of resistances for all of your melee stacks. So this grants almost 4,000 spell and physical resistance to people within 8 meters of you. Procs very, very frequently, so it's a very nice resistance buff to everybody around. It's very nice for stack and burn fights, and as well as for trash pulls. Second set that you're going to want to pick up here is going to be Bloodspawn. Bloodspawn comes from, blanking on it, Spindle Clutch 2, I believe. So very nice to have. It's not as useful as Lord Warden because it only gives you the resistance buff. It does have a very low chance to proc. It's mainly used for greater Warhorn uptime because it does provide some additional ultimate when it procs. So it's mainly used for more ultimate uptime, and if you're less concerned about group survivability and your own personal survivability. Next Helm set you're going to want to pick up is going to be Thermicon. This comes from Scale Caller Peak. No, not Scale Caller Peak, Fanglair. So this is a pretty nice set to have. It's basically an AoE minor maims, minor defile. So it's very useful for fights where you have a lot of trash that you don't necessarily want to waste a lot of stamina going around heroic slashing everything. So I do recommend picking up Thermicon. You probably won't use it all too much, but it does have its niche uses, so I do recommend picking it up. Fourth monster helm set you're going to want to pick up is going to be Earthgore. So Earthgore comes from Bloodroot Forge, so you will need access to Horns of the Reach DLC in order to get it. This is just nice for that burst heal. It does have a very long cooldown, 35 seconds, so I do not recommend relying on it for the burst heal. But when you do get that burst heal, it's really nice. You get to play a little bit more aggressively, you get to spam balance while it's healing you, that sort of thing. So I do recommend picking up Earthgore. Then the fifth monster helm set, again, this is a little bit controversial, but I have seen it put to good use, and that's going to be Chudan. So this comes from Ruins of Mazatoon. So this basically grants you major ward, major resolve at all times. So it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to run Mighty Chudan. However, this ability to basically not worry about having to, keep up your armor buff is really nice. It basically gives you an additional slot, basically an ability slot to have. Me personally, I don't really see it being used all too much, and I personally don't have a set myself. However, if you're an off tank for Asylum hard mode, for instance, a lot of off tanks do swear by running Chudan. So it is a set that you might want to consider picking up, just kind of for that niche use there. Very similar to Thermicon, where it has a very, very niche use, but in that niche, it is a very powerful set to run. So unlike Healers, you don't really have any sort of tanking specific sets, nothing like the Master's Sword and Board, for instance. There's not really that much there. Those sets are not actually all that useful for tanks. So it's mainly those 5 armor sets and then those monster helm sets that I covered there. Those are the sets that you're going to want to pick up before you start to join any vet trials. So a lot of vet trials guilds will be looking for tanks that have these sets before they ask you to join. Now, in terms of the recruitment process itself, guilds, very similar to healers, have very, very different ways of kind of assessing tanks and picking which tanks get to join their team. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there are a few objective measures that guilds can use. So obviously, buff, debuff, uptimes are going to be the most objective measures because there are actual numbers tied to them with comment metrics, reports, and things like that. So a lot of the common debuffs that you're going to want to take a look at and kind of improve on are going to be Crusher, Weakening in some instances, and Alkash. So it's mainly going to be the Crusher enchant and then the Alkash debuff. Those are the 2 ones that you're going to want to take a look at the most. Of course, there are some other debuffs that tanks do apply, things like Major Fracture and Major Breach through PH Armor, for example. But because you should be having taunt on the boss at all times, those should always pretty much be at 100% or very, very close to 100%. So it's mainly looking at those Crusher and Alkash debuff uptimes there. Obviously, there are a couple of other subjective measures, and I say subjective kind of loosely here because each guild and each group kind of runs content a little bit differently here. So obviously, one measurement of being a good tank is how well you're able to survive, how are you maintaining taunt, things like that. Are you facing the boss in the correct direction? And these are going to differ a little bit depending on raid lead, just because, again, of different strategies that people use for vet trials. But generally speaking, you should never be losing taunt, you should never be dying, and you should never be facing a boss towards the group. So if you are not doing one of those 3 things, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult for a raid lead to kind of say, okay, let's take this tank with us for our progression run. So those 3 things are pretty much the bread and butter of tanking. So never lose taunt, never die, and always face the boss away from group. And then again, those buffs, debuff, uptimes, and then from there, it's pretty much very subjective and very kind of dependent on each specific raid group. So, for example, Hellfire Dominion, we look for tanks that when we run through vet DLC dungeons. We take a look at their debuff uptimes, their buff uptimes, their survivability, whether it felt like they were taking too many hits, whether our healer felt like they had to babysit them, quote unquote, a little bit too much. That's kind of what we look for in Hellfire Dominion. Mayflower, you actually can't join as a tank, even as a fill, unless you have a reference from somebody already in the guild itself. It's preferably somebody that is a support role themselves, either a tank or a healer. So it's a little bit more difficult to get into Mayflower, mainly because it's very hard for us to judge how well a tank does. There's no parse test for a tank, and while Hellfire Dominion we do vet DLC dungeons, they're imperfect because each fight's going to be a little bit different that way. So Mayflower decided to completely cut that out and just say we will only take people if they have references from a tank or a healer in our guild itself, or if we kind of know them just from the grapevine and throughout the raiding community kind of thing. So just take a look at those specific requirements for the guild that you want to join. Again, each guild has its own different requirements. The most consistent things are going to be those armor sets, as well as those 3 main points that I mentioned earlier: the taunt, the survivability, and then the boss positioning. So that's kind of what you want to keep in mind when you're looking to join Vet Trials guilds as a tank. Now, once you've joined these guilds, very similar to healers, your performance is going to be based, again, on those debuffs and buffs that you're able to put out for the group. So, is your Alkosh uptime increasing? Is your Crusher uptime increasing? Are you surviving better? Does your healer feel like they can take some heals off of you, shift it toward the group, kind of focus on buffing the group more instead of healing you? Those are the kind of things that raiders are going to be looking for when they kind of look at their tanks and how they're improving throughout the progression process. First, limited healers, it's very difficult for raid leads to kind of assess whether or not a support role is improving outside of just asking them straight up, hey, do you feel like you're improving? The most objective measures that we have are going to be those buff debuff uptime. So as a tank, you should be trying to aim for better and better debuff and buff uptimes. So if you have Alkosh that's, let's say, at like 40-50%, you want to shoot a little bit higher, maybe 60-70% instead. As you get more comfortable with the fights, this should be a little bit easier, and then you should be able to transition away from the tankier set. So for example, instead of wearing like Ebon Plague Doctor, you might be able to do something like Dragon Guard and Alkosh instead, in order to basically maximize your 4-horn uptime and maximize your resistance debuffs that you're able to provide for the group. And so that's pretty much how you can kind of measure your progression as a tank in Vet Trials. Again, it's very difficult to kind of objectively measure it. It's going to be a lot more subjective, and it's going to take a lot of self-awareness here. Generally speaking, tanks are going to be the ones that are going to need to know the most about a trial in terms of mechanics. So that's another big thing that raid leads look for. While a lot of people say tanks are the ones leading the charge, not necessarily always going to be the case. Obviously, the raid lead is the one who is leading the raid, but tanks generally are going to be the ones that are expected to have the most knowledge about a trial and its mechanics. A tank that doesn't know the boss mechanics is not going to be a very good tank. So if you are going to join a Vet Trials group as a tank, you should do your homework. You should watch videos. You should be looking at guides online for these specific fights. So classic example is Hall of Fabrication, that second boss. The palm strikes trips up a lot of new tanks very, very quickly. So you really need to be able to pick up on that mechanic very fast, or develop strategies with your raid lead if you're not able to kind of reliably block those palm strikes from the Pinnacle Factotum. So that's an example of, if you are going to be joining as a tank, you kind of have a small leadership role in the guild itself, in that group, because you are expected to know all these mechanics, you're expected to know how to deal with these mechanics, and you are kind of expected to help the raid lead out when it comes to, hey, how do we deal with this mechanic that's been tripping us up for the past 2 or 3 runs and things like that. So if you're joining as a tank, be prepared to take a little bit of that responsibility, a little bit of that leadership mantle. People will be looking for you to kind of know what you're doing in terms of fight mechanics, just because as a tank, if you go down, the entire raid just completely goes to crap. So that's something you're going to want to be prepared for as a tank. That's pretty much covers everything that is tank specific for kind of getting involved in Vet Trials, what to expect from Vet Trials. If you guys are interested in knowing what it is, how to prepare as a healer or DPS, check out the previous 2 videos that I had. And again, that first video that I released in this series does cover just kind of generic advice and kind of generic what to expect as you're going into Vet Trials. So again, I do recommend watching that first video and then coming back to the second, third, or fourth video in this series depending on which roles that you're going to want to join as. Each of these 3 different roles does have different expectations, does have different requirements that you're going to want to anticipate before you join a Vet Trials Guild in that specific role. There is going to be one more video in this series, and this is going to be for those aspiring raid leads. I'm going to give you a little bit of pieces of advice that I've picked up from watching different raid leads, from being in different raid guilds, and as well as from my personal experience leading Hellfire Dominion. Hopefully you guys will be able to find the advice that I have in that video to be very useful as you are kind of shaping your progression team, as you're shaping your guild, and picking out members and things like that. So that covers it for this video. If you guys have any other pieces of advice that you would like to share, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. If you have any questions or comments, again, comment section below. I'll try to get back to them as soon as I can. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.